Good afternoon. I'm John Yemberg with the Office of Communications. Welcome to the 10th anniversary of the International Space Station discussion at NASA headquarters in Washington. On November 2nd, 2000, the crew of Expedition 1 became the first residents of the International Space Station. Since then, over 200 visitors have explored the International Space Station. We've had 15 countries contributed modules and hardware, and 600 experiments have been conducted. Over 600 experiments have been conducted on the complex. On this Tuesday, we're going to be celebrating 10 years of permanent human residency aboard the complex. Here today to discuss that milestone is the Associate Administrator for Space Operations, Bill Gerstenmaier.
Good afternoon.
The Associate Administrator for Independent Program and Cost Evaluation and the former Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Station, Mike Hawes. Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Operations, Lynn Klein. And the Assistant Associate Administrator for International Space Station, Mark Uran. I'm going to start off by asking the panelists a few questions, then we'll take questions from the audience later in the program. This question is really for all of you, but we'll start off with Mark. How did you first become involved with the space station, and how has your role since evolved?
Let's see, it was 1984, and I was involved in the renewable energy industry when OPEC lost its cartel power, and I got an assignment to do a workshop on research requirements for the space station. This was back at the very beginning of Phase A. And I basically worked on those requirements for a decade. And then as the program became operational and we started actually implementing the research, I became involved in developing the uses of the station as a national laboratory, and that brings us up to today.
Okay. Lynn?
Well, when we started the space station program, I was actually working on space and earth science activities, but I was carpooling with somebody who was on the space station negotiating team. So my initial role in space station was vicariously hearing on the way home all the stories on what was going on. My own personal role began when we invited Russia to join the program. My first job on the International Space Station was to work with our original partners, Canada, Europe, and Japan, and negotiate the joint invitation to formally, through diplomatic channels, invite Russia to join the program. And then I was asked to lead the negotiations to bring Russia into the program. And it's changed over time because at that point, I was always involved in the front end of programs, just putting in place partnerships. And now I find myself on the other end in a program office where we're responsible for implementing those things that we put into the agreements years ago.
Okay, great. Mike?
I was at the Johnson Space Center, and in 1986, working within the Mission Ops Directorate, Gene Kranz decided that I needed to try something new and assigned me to one of a group of space station sections that we set up in MOD, and that got me started. And then I spent all 6 years of the Rest and Freedom Program office and downtown, and up until when I left Space Ops a couple years ago to do all the cross-agency stuff in IPCE. I've spent an awful lot of time on space station.
Okay. Bill?
Yeah, I actually started with space station in 1989. Down at the Johnson Space Center. My job was I was on the shuttle side, and our job was essentially to figure out how to put together space station. In the very beginning, it started out with the truss being actually built itself from scratch. We call it sticks and balls space station, where we actually assembled we're going to assemble the various truss members, then actually string the wiring in the truss, and then actually put all the electronics and avionics components in the truss. So that was the first activity I had and supported in 1989. And then we went to pre-integrated truss, and then I continued to work with the program until 1992. Then I went away to school when the Russians got added. Then I came back to the shuttle program, I guess after I got back from school. And then eventually I became Deputy Station Program Manager at the end. So I was there, put together most of the original assembly sequences that were used prior to the addition of the Russians, and somehow those assembly sequences really held together throughout the entire period, and I got to see them actually get implemented by the shuttle team in later years. So I've been kind of on and off the program between shuttle and station throughout the entire period of time. I wasn't there from the very beginning, but started in 1989, I think right after Mike in his area down at Johnson.
Okay, great. In 1984, then President Ronald Reagan announced the development of a permanent manned space station. How have we gone, and which was dubbed Space Station Freedom, how have we gone from Freedom to where we are today with the International Space Station? How did that process happen, and how is the station different today than originally conceived?
I'll take the first shot and see where folks want to go with it. Fundamentally, we worked on Space Station Freedom once we established the Reston Program Office. As Mark said, it started in Phase A, actually, in that 84 time frame. So from 84 till about 92, and we were working with the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Canadians as partners already in the endeavor. When we went through the redesign in 92, 93, we were then asked to look at adding the Russians to the configuration. That allowed us to simplify some of the U.S. capabilities. We no longer had U.S. propulsion, for an example. But it was an incredible learning experience, because that 10 years that we had spent with the other partners kind of forming a team and agreeing on technical standards for all of these different functions, we now had to figure out how to do that very quickly with the Russians. The main truss, backbone, and everything on the space station is pretty much as it's been since the early years. So a lot of the configuration is pretty much as we had planned it since the earliest time.
How about the missions? I've read things before that Freedom was supposed to service satellites and do some things that the space station now doesn't. How has that changed? Why did that change?
Well, there were originally 8 missions for the space station envisioned, and I would argue that today we really see the remnants of all 8 of those missions. Even satellite servicing. The technology's changed so dramatically over 25 years that there are opportunities to do things differently than they were envisioned 20 years ago. So, we're starting to look at deployments and retrievals of potentially nano satellites from the station. We're looking at satellite servicing demonstrations on the station. So many of the original 8 missions are still applicable in varying degrees.
Yeah, early on, folks tended to associate those missions with a unique component of the space station. So during redesigns, as those components may have been deleted or changed, a lot of folks presumed that that mission was no longer supported. But I really agree with Mark. I see ability to do pieces of all of those missions in the space station that we have today.
Today there's 15 partner nations that contribute to the International Space Station. Lynn, could you explain a little bit the process, how that came to be, and how the agreements were put together?
Well, we already had a lot of experience on the shuttle with what I'll call our traditional partners, Canada, Europe, and Japan. With Canada, we had the remote manipulator system on the arm on the shuttle. With Europe, we had the Space Lab experience. Japan had not contributed an element to the shuttle, so when we started talking with them, they were very interested in doing so in our next human spaceflight endeavor. So we had looked at what were our past experiences, what were their capabilities. We'd had studies going on for years on what we might come up with in terms of a design and what partners wanted to do. So we really knew who those partners were going to be when the program was announced, and then we had to go through the formal process to invite them and work the negotiations. But it was really built on a long history of collaboration with those nations already.
And I would add that I think the thing that's kind of interesting about all this history as we look back is we put together a basic framework from both a hardware standpoint and even from an international partner standpoint that was pretty flexible. So as things changed and missions changed, the hardware was able to adapt to a kind of a changing mission, a changing role. The agreements, the MOUs, the intergovernmental agreements, those things, they're flexible enough that we could adapt those and morph those as we added other partners, and we did things that weren't really envisioned in the beginning, but they gave us enough of a structure that we could hang together as a team and continue to move forward. So I think the big kind of lesson learned is that when you start out a project is make sure you got the right flexibility inherent in the design, because you may not end up with exactly what you envisioned when you first put the concept together, but you need that framework put together that you can operate in a different way.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me is when we started design and development, we operated under a structure that we referred to as being bilateral, where it was the U.S. to Japan, the U.S. to ESA, the U.S. to Canada, and then ultimately Russia. And that was to try to ensure that we weren't in each other's critical path. And we always envisioned that we would get to this operational timeframe that would be fully multilateral, where the full team was working together. And I remember going through those years never thinking we were ever going to get to that multilateral point. And that's what we do every day now. I mean, that's what Gerst does every day. That's what the mission management team does every day, is work in that fully multilateral mode with all partners present, all partners working their issues, and coming up with totally joint solutions.
And did the ideas, did the development change, or did the structure change at all when you decided to make Russia a partner on the space stations? I know originally wasn't conceived to be, they weren't originally conceived to be a partner of space station. What changed when they became involved?
From a physical configuration, like I said, we dropped propulsion modules that we had planned on the U.S. side. We went to a different module configuration. We used to have what we called a racetrack configuration of nodes in the lab and hab modules. And we incorporated what the Russians felt that they could contribute to the program, and worked on what that central core configuration was with the FGB and then the service module provided through the Russians. And so we had to do some things in the interfaces that were a little different than we did with the other partners, but we did bring the Russians into that full multilateral partnership. Still had some aspects of the relationship which were bilateral and others that were fully multilateral.
Another thing that changed was partner roles in transportation. So in the original agreements, it always had provided that other partners could bring their transportation systems up to the station. But when we brought Russia into the program, Europe and Japan also asked for a greater role for their transportation systems. And so we ended up, as we renegotiated the agreements, putting in offset arrangements to use the Ariane and the H-2 for the cargo capability and reboost, things like that, and those were to offset their common systems operations costs that were also always there in the agreement, but there was a preference for trading goods and services rather than paying in cash. And so cementing those into specific obligations in the agreement, that changed when we went through that second round of negotiations.
And obviously, without the Russians, we had no alternative crew transport to the space station. It was all envisioned on the space shuttle.
And before there was the space station, there was the Russian space station Mir. Did we learn any lessons from, over a decade of use of space station Mir before the space station was developed and implemented?
Yeah, I think the phase 1 program we had, where we actually used the shuttle to go to Mir, was unbelievably beneficial for us in learning how to operate with the Russians and how to operate long-duration space flight. We were very good at shuttle missions, a week or 2 weeks of very dedicated, very focused activities. We had not had much experience at doing long-duration, multiple-month activities, and we were fairly inexperienced in some of that. So I think we learned a lot from the Russians in our phase 1 program that we carried into the station operations piece. I think the Mir also benefited tremendously from the shuttle being there. I think Mir's life was actually extended by the fact that we had the ability to bring large components up to Mir and return components from Mir down. So I think it was a good learning experience. It also allowed us to learn to work bilaterally with the Russians. I think it would have been tough to step right up to space station operations without some experience of operating with them on the Mir program. So it was it was a good chance for us to learn, develop techniques, and learn to operate together bilaterally, and then get ready to move into the station stuff. And what Mike brought up was very interesting. We worked pretty strongly bilaterally with the Russians because the FGB was there, our modules were there. Then we started bringing up the other partner modules, Columbus and the Japanese, and then we had to add them in. And then that really forced us to start really working in a true multilateral environment. But I don't think we could have gotten there as easily. It really helped to do the bilateral pieces first and establish those relationships that you had something to build off before you step to the more integrated multilateral program.
Okay. Fast forward to space station we are today. Mark, one of the things that we have trouble communicating to the outside world, we kind of understand the potential for scientific research for space station inside NASA, but sometimes that's hard to communicate to others that don't quite get it. What would you say, how would you describe the unique environment of space station and why that's important to researchers?
Well, when you take gravity out of equations of motion, you fundamentally change the way particles interact at the cellular or the molecular level. Whether you're looking at inorganic systems like metals and alloys that are undergoing a change of state, or biological systems like cells and molecular structures, they all have motion in them. And that motion follows laws of motion that we understand very well on the ground in a 1G environment. But you put it up in space and you take gravity out of that equation of motion and you get a different answer. And sometimes those different answers can really lead to some provocative results.
Okay. Well, the milestone we're celebrating here today is 10 years of human occupancy on space station. Mr. Gerstenmaier, was there ever a time when you felt that the space station might have to be demanned? Was there either a technical reason or a logistical reason why you would no longer be able to keep people on station?
It was, if we kind of start back at the very beginning, it was interesting because station we used to build from the solar arrays inboard, and that made sense because we had power up first and then communication systems, and then we built essentially the support structure, and then we hung the pressurized modules underneath, and then we were going to add the crew, right? Well, and I have documentation where that's the way we had put the plan together, and then we were told that that wasn't going to cut it because we needed to get crew there earlier, so we needed to build the other way out. We needed to start with the pressurized modules and then build outward. So we had to redo the entire sequence. That forced us to put the P6 temporary truss, that's the port 6 solar array up on top to provide temporary power. We were lucky we had the FGB, so we could use it as a power source and provide life support for us. It provided those basic functions on station, and then we could build outward. So I think the first thing was that we got told to do it a different way than we would have done it technically, because it was important to get crew on orbit to actually start doing some research and utilize the facility and not wait 7 years until everything got built out and then you were ready to bring the crew up. So that was an important first consideration. I was in the shuttle program at the time when we decided to bring the first crew up. We had not really even brought the first solar array up, I believe, when we added the crew. I probably, from a technical standpoint, I would have waited maybe one more flight before we added crew. And I remember having some discussions with Tommy Holloway. Again, I was the evil shuttle side and he was the station side at the time. And I told him we ought to wait one more flight, and he told me there's no way we're waiting one more flight. We're going to bring the crew up now. The station is ready for them. So I would tell you again, from my conservative technical standpoint, I might have waited another flight before we brought the crew on orbit, but we did, and it was fine. There was the station worked well and things went forward. I think when we had the Columbia tragedy, that was probably the closest we came to really having to remove the crew. We looked at what it would take to keep 3 crew members on station without the shuttle capability, and there was just no way we could support the full complement of 3 crew. And so we had a choice to go back and recommend they get additional Soyuz and Progress vehicles, but we were prohibited because of the Iran North Korea, Syria Non-Proliferation Act of getting those extra modules, so we really had no choice but to drop the crew size. And then when we dropped the crew size, it wasn't guaranteed that we could actually make it through that first summer. In fact, we were going to be short of water. The shuttle, because of its fuel cells, generates a lot of water. We hadn't worried about water. It was a very plentiful source because the shuttle was always there, but when the shuttle was pulled away, we didn't have enough water to really make it through that summer. And we really needed a way to get water to the station. We wanted to make a mod to the Progress vehicle to add additional water tanks, but we couldn't do that because we didn't have the ability to spend money with the Russians. The Russians didn't want to do it without us spending money to do the tank, so we spent many wonderful meetings throughout that spring trying to figure out how we were going to keep the crew on orbit. And then I went over to Russia for a series of meetings, and they were showing me around the floor where they build the Soyuz and the Progress vehicles, and they told me to stick my head in the Progress vehicle, and I did. And right in the middle of the Progress vehicle was welded a water tank. And so then they told me that we do what we need to do when it's time to go do it, but not before. And so they put the water tank in, which allowed us to make it through the summer with the 2-person crew. And we had not done very good in keeping track of food and supplies and cargo. We then implemented all these things to keep track of all these supplies. And we built essentially a timeline that was a variable. We didn't know exactly when the shuttle was going to return to flight, so we had to just do the best to kind of fly from milestone to milestone, know when we had to make decisions, when we had to fly hardware up. So there was no guarantee. I used to tell the station team that, our job is to return the crew safely. If we can keep them on orbit, great, but if we need to know in advance, that enough 40 days in advance, that we can schedule a return, so we can get them in the Soyuz, we can schedule the right rescue forces to be there to pick them up. So it's just like a nominal end of mission. So it would be a little bit early, but it would be a normal end of mission for the crew. So the crew would be no additional safety risk. But our job was to anticipate with enough knowledge that we were 40 days from having to return the crew. So we kind of kept a running timeline of, were we that many days away from having to return the crew? And if the wrong components would have broke at the wrong time in the wrong sequence, we probably would have had to return the crew. But we were lucky during the whole downtime that all the hardware stayed together. We had some pumps that failed and some other components that failed, but we had enough time to bring them up. So it was a tight period through that point. But again, the teams did a phenomenal job of handling uncertainty and figuring out a way to deal and operate in that manner. So again, I think we learned tremendous lessons about what you can do and how, with the right overarching goals, you can accomplish amazing things if you set your targets the right way and you remain flexible throughout the period to get done what you need to go do. So it was an interesting period to get through, and it worked out very well in hindsight, but there sure were no guarantees as we were going through this whole period.
One of the interesting things, and Gerst raised it earlier in terms of the shuttle mentality we had versus the long-duration spaceflight mentality that the Russians had. And we had intellectual discussions, I would say, about that difference for a long time. And, also in your reaction to crises. On the shuttle side, we have all kinds of rules about this failure, that failure, you come home, and how quickly do you come home? Well, in a space station kind of scenario, it's what do you do to stay there and deal with your situation and keep the ship flying? More akin to an accident and an issue that you would have out on a ship somewhere in the ocean. And now, having lived through not just the Columbia time frame that Gerst talked about, but there have been all kinds of issues where equipment has failed, and we've been down tracking margins really carefully to get through those months. But that's what we're ultimately learning, and that's what we have to learn to explore, because we're not coming home. We're celebrating 10 years that not every human has lived on the planet. And if we're going to go beyond, our biggest strategic goal, number one, is expand human presence beyond low Earth orbit. Those are the things we have to learn. How do you continue to get further in distance and time from our home planet, yet be able to deal with all of those challenges that we have in spaceflight? That's what space station is.
Great. It'd be nice if each of you can answer this question. The past decade, what would you describe as the biggest large-scale and small-scale challenge you've faced, or the space station has faced? Mark?
On the large scale, when I reflect back on the 1980s, the late 80s, as the first partners were coming on board, it really began as a Tower of Babel. It was very difficult at the beginning, but within 2 to 3 years, it came together. And then over a decade, we had families. We had people getting married between partners, children being born. So the challenge was fusing that team. And once that team was fused, it's an incredible performance. And I don't really think there were any small challenges. I mean, the way I look back on the station program, we lurched from what at the time seemed like insurmountable challenges that were eventually, every single one of them, overcome.
Okay. Lynn?
Yeah, from my personal experience, the biggest challenge was bringing Russia into the program. I haven't been working down in the technical details, but up at that sort of big picture policy level, and it was driven by budget pressures, political pressures, a whole lot of external factors beyond NASA that forced it. It really tested our original partnership. I think there was concern by Canada, Europe, and Japan that somehow they would be not viewed as important because the Russians came with so much capability. And we've heard a little bit about the differences in how we were doing human spaceflight and how the Russians were. Merging those two different philosophical approaches, and coming to the point now where it is a partnership that is a single partnership and not us versus them kind of an attitude, I think was a really big challenge that we've overcome.
Great.
You know, the early years of the space station for me were just a continuum of budget cuts and redesigns and going through the transition that Bill described, where we actually convinced ourselves that we weren't going to be able to build a space station, and we had to go with what we called pre-integrated trust, with everything built and assembled on the ground. You know, and then you have the 92, 93 redesign and the addition of the Russians, and you know, every one of those was a big challenge and tough, and it was tough to hold the team together. On the small side, you know, I can remember having arguments probably just as passionate as those big moments about what a specific requirement said in a particular requirements document that, you know, in the rearview mirror looks a whole lot less important than what we've accomplished over the years.
Yeah, I think back there were, I mean, it's amazing the things that we've been through. It's, you know, we started out with a station that was, like I talked about, that was essentially assembled from scratch. We did a huge study up here where we looked at all kinds of different options of rebuilding space station. We must have had 15 different concepts come together of different ways to build station. And then we ended up with the pre-integrated truss, and then the Reston team was getting started, and that was a tough thing for us to centralize program management away from a field center up here in Washington. And then we just about got Reston functional, and then we decided that wasn't a good idea, so let's break apart Reston and let's get rid of the work packages and let's hire a prime contractor. And all these things are, any one of them could have ended the program. You know, then we had the famous one vote that kept station alive, which was a huge thing. Our station was going to be gone. We had, in 2000, we were $5 billion over budget. They came in and told us essentially Node 3 was not going to fly, the habitation module wasn't going to fly, Cupola wasn't going to fly, regenerative eclipse wasn't going to be there, Spidum wasn't going to, Dexter wasn't going to be there. And then somehow all those things are still on station, and we still somehow cut $5 billion out of our budget, which was not the most pleasant thing in the world. So you look at all those things, and any one of them you could have just thrown in the towel and quit. But I think the spirit of the partnership was we became dependent upon each other. We recognized the potential of station, and so we kept moving forward. So now I think the big challenge is, you know, we've been through this 10 years of human presence. Now we need to look forward to that next 10 years of research and actually reaping some benefit from this wonderful facility we've built into space. So we now need to take that same optimism, that same zeal that we put into that assembly to get here, and throw that into research and see if we can really show the true benefit of space. So that's our next challenge, and I'm sure it will be full of all these big challenges that are coming. Every day there's something new that's a little tough to work around, and we'll keep moving forward. You know, when we got told that shuttle would be no longer available to service station, that was tough to figure out how to make all that work. We think we've got plans there. We're going to count on commercial cargo. There's still some learning that will occur through that. So I think there's lots of challenges coming. But the important thing is to stay focused, realize now the potential for research to work internationally to gain and push that research forward.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question before seeing if the audience has any questions. What is your, for the next, we've gone 10 years, there's 10 more, you know, the space station's supposed to fly for at least another 10. What is your hope for the next decade? What's the biggest accomplishment going to be in the years to come, would you say? Each probably has a different opinion. Mark?
Yeah, I'll take a start at that, because I can see two major achievements ahead of us. This is a fantastic platform for doing technology development and demonstration, and we've never had anything like it before available to us. So I think we have the opportunity to use it to develop our next generation systems. I mean, we're doing that already today with the onboard systems like the regenerative eclipse, but there's tremendous potential available to do that. And then the second area, the scientific potential. Science is a slow process. I mean, we are just now seeing results from 10 years ago that were conducted on shuttle missions that are turning into products and companies, profitable companies that were being formed. I mean, I'll tell one short story just because a lot of people may not be aware of it, but just last month, Apple Computer bought the exclusive worldwide patent rights for liquid metals, which were originally discovered on the space shuttle in 1997 doing thermophysical property measurements by a PI at Caltech. Now, that's not generally well known, but it's a significant finding, and in some places they characterize liquid metals as being as important as plastics were when they replaced steel. So I think we have the opportunity to make more contributions like that in the 10 years.
Lynn?
And as folks have said, this is a very capable platform. It can be used for many different things. So my hope for the future is we fully utilize it. We use it in many different ways. I think it's really hard to predict what the research will show. That's a process of discovery. We have a lot of things we can do on station to prepare for exploration, and we really ought to be doing that. I think that this, while it is in low Earth orbit, it is a step towards going out beyond low Earth orbit, and so we really ought to take advantage of that. And we have such a strong partnership. I would like to see us use this really to help build the continued partnership for going beyond, working together, figuring out what are those next steps for exploration, and using station to do that, to demonstrate it.
Mike?
It's going to get repetitive pretty quick, right? You're not going to have anything to say. This is the place we have to learn. And we've had that validated now that we're going to keep flying the space station. And this is, we've learned so much already just about how we operate in space. Things that we never planned in the program, things that we had never really thought we were going to accomplish, even to just basics of maintaining this facility, are all things that we have to be able to do as we go further out. So it is going to be the platform that drives us in exploration, and we are going to be in a constrained environment, so we're going to be using everything that we have today to build from where we are out into exploration. The space station is going to be a critical part of that.
And I guess I would just add that I really consider station a platform for discovery, but in a whole variety of different areas. It's some of the scientific areas that Mark talks about. We were able to recently activate the Sabatier system, which is an experiment in a new way of procuring hardware. We didn't pay for the development of the hardware for the first time. We let a contractor pay for the development of the hardware, and then they only receive payments if the device generates water for us. We did that without any NASA involvement. They did all the design development on their own. It fit well because we had done a lot of pre-research on the NASA side, so we knew what the interfaces were, and a technical risk was something that a contractor could essentially pick up and go operate. So Station has already proven itself as a platform for discovery and new ways of contracting and new ways of doing development. The partnership has published a very nice lessons learned document where I ask each one of the partners to think about exploration and what lesson did you learn as an individual country for the way we should do exploration, and we got a very nice document of the partnership pulling together to go do that. And then we've also used a partnership recently to put together the basis of an international docking standard. So I used the partners to work together to go essentially put together the specifications to allow spacecraft to dock, not a specific design, but just the standard. So what's the basic diameter, what's the basic hook force, what's the basic loading, what's the mechanism that allows for soft capture, etc. But we're not specifying a design. So then individual countries can go ahead and then if they meet this standard, we'll have compatibility to go dock things. So the station has provided a multilateral environment so where we can put together and work as a small group to put some new standards out there that may be the standards that will be used for exploration systems in the future. So there's a tremendous amount of potential to discover new things from a technology standpoint, from a research standpoint, from a contracting standpoint, and from a way of doing new system standards for new systems needed for exploration systems in the future. So I think there's a lot of things. We shouldn't constrain ourselves. Just keep looking forward, keep challenging ourselves to do new things, and we'll see what we can get in the next 10 years.
Okay, thanks. We'll see if there's any questions from the audience for the panel members. Okay, up there in the back.
You've all done a really good job of pointing out the challenges that we've had in dealing with the different partners. One of the other major challenges I think that we've run into, or that we have, is perhaps dealing with those two other big areas, the engineering community and the research community. Wondering if you could share what you think have been the major obstacles in dealing across those two populations, as well as some of the major accomplishments that have occurred as a result of those two working together.
Well, I'll have to answer that one, John. I think I've spent the last 25 years working on the boundary between those two communities. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages in the positions they take, and success comes when they work together. You know that. We've gone a long way over the past 25 years. Probably most emblematic of that is the fact that we delayed much of the utilization in order to complete the assembly process. That was an extremely controversial issue that was even debated in the congressional hallways back in the early 90s. But when I look back on it in retrospect, it was the right thing to do, because now we've got a completed space station. We didn't put it at risk during that assembly phase, and we're positioned to have a decade of useful utilization coming out of it. And I think the research team distributed across the NASA centers, as well as out in the academic and the industrial community, are willing to step forward now that we have the completed space station. So I see the next 10 years as being nothing but opportunity for us.
Any other questions from anyone in the audience? Back row.
What is the likelihood that private sector would eventually dock on station?
Well, we've got for cargo delivery, we've issued some fixed price contracts with Orbital and SpaceX to deliver cargo to space stations. So they're going to be a private entity that will bring cargo for us to space station under a contract to NASA. So I think that piece is clearly there. Through the National Lab, Mark can talk a little bit about that, but I think there'll be some opportunities for commercial companies. In fact, there are some now that are actually even utilizing station for some research, and we need to figure out more ways of letting folks go ahead and use station. And Mark, you might want to add something.
Yeah, we began that work actually 10 years ago, working partnerships out with private firms for use of the spacecraft. And now that the assembly's done, we're going to be growing that whole area. I mean, most people are familiar, I think, with the fact that we're literally just a few weeks away from announcing a competitive procurement to establish a cooperative agreement with a nonprofit organization to manage uses of the space station by organizations other than NASA. So I think you're going to see all that activity ramping up in the future. And we've got the perfect platform to do it with.
You know, I think it's also interesting to see how we got pushed to do some things a little differently than we would have probably on our own, like the whole spaceflight participant thing. You know, the Russians were very aggressive in selling Soyuz seats to get spaceflight participants up to station. I don't think NASA would have done that on our own, but then the Russians have kind of pushed us in an area that I think there's some potential there that moves forward. Even in their control center, they have a lot of, if you look at the bottom floor below their screen, there's advertisements from all the major vendors out there that provide equipment to their control center. That's a little far for us to go, but they somehow have gathered or captured maybe the capitalistic processes better than we have in a sense. So we again need to learn from them. But there's a real advantage of doing things internationally and learning from others. So we need to see what works, see what other countries are pushing, see how they're pursuing things, and then likewise open up our envelope a little bit to be a little more flexible than we would be naturally. So I think the partnership has brought a unique dimension to us that has really, really helped us look in different ways, the way we think about spaceflight.
And I think typically we find the partners are each at different points along that spectrum. They all have different views, and having to integrate all of that I think is even more thoughtful than just having to look at one extreme position or another extreme position. The recognition that we really are a continuum helps us, I think, be open-minded.
My question is for Bill, but any of you all can answer this. Bill, it's really interesting to hear sort of your take on the spirit of creativity and innovation that comes about when you leave things sort of wide open and let people sort of take advantage of the open parameters. You spoke earlier to making sure that, you know, in the future we have some of that ability with MOUs and agreements that are really flexible. So I was wondering, you said that at each stage of the station and the development, you said that, you know, things happened that, you know, made the space station be able to be used not as designed. What were some of those things that, you know, came about as a result of that spirit of innovation and creativity that you really never thought would be used or done on the space station that created a difference to us?
Well, we never anticipated the Russians bringing tourists to the space station, and obviously the very first one was a pretty dramatic moment in time, but we became used to it, and it didn't cause us any problems ultimately.
Yeah, I would give, you know, to see the crew with clown noses in space was probably a unique thing that I would not have ever envisioned. I would say we also did an activity with the band U2 throughout the world, and they featured the space station crew in several venues in various countries around the world, and that was an interesting experience to be called by the band personally and congratulated on the crew, talking to them at some concert someplace, which was very interesting and unique, which I would have not have guessed. You know, developing the combined operational load-bearing external resistive treadmill for the Node 3 Tranquility was a unique experience for us. You know, we had put together a very well thought out media plan to get a name the node contest with all the right legal arguments in there that allowed us to name it whatever we wanted to name it. And then we kind of lost control of the whole process when Xena the Warrior Princess was winning for a while. And then my yearbook kind of came in later, and then the Colbert Show took over. So, and then we determined that it didn't matter what all our legal statements said. People in general were going to dictate how we named the node and what criteria we used. And even though we had the legal authority to do things, we then had to get kind of creative to come up with the combined operational load-bearing external resistive treadmill. So we learned a lot through all that. So I think that the thing is by challenging folks to do things and think in different ways, you get different results. And you know, I've gotten a lot of positive comments. We've exposed station to a broader community by doing things along those lines. And I think it gets some of our people excited. You can't do too much of that, but you got to figure out where the serious scientific work is done, and then where there's a little bit of a lighter side that keeps things moving forward. So,
well, and Bill talked about Sabatier as well, and you know, when he and I were commiserating even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we never would have had a discussion about buying water. You know, not buying the device, but literally buying water. And so as we have evolved with the space station, as we've understood the maturity of all the systems, you really can do very, very different things if you keep your mind open to it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody ever anticipated this global mixed fleet that we're working with today either. I mean, when we started this program, before the Russians were on board, it was all shuttle-based transportation, and it was designed to be serviced by the shuttle. But then the European ATV, the Japanese ATV, then the Russian partnership with the Progress. It's really a pretty impressive global fleet of vehicles that we've got coming and going today, and more to come.
I mean, if you look next year, I think we have 17 flights to space station next year, and 2 of those are shuttle, and then the rest are ATV and Progress and Soyuz, and also some of our commercial cargo providers will be there next year too. So we've really created a much more dynamic and diverse transportation plan than I think we ever envisioned, clearly.
Any other questions from the audience?
We have a lot of aging infrastructure down here on the ground and some aging bodies as well. I have an 8-year-old at home, though, that would be interested someday in flying on the space station. What's the likelihood of the space station having even a further extended period of operations beyond the 2020 timeframe.
That's yours.
Well, we've been looking, we go to 2020, and then I think we've looked at going, I think, all the way out to 2028, and that's based on, I think, a 30-year lifetime from when the first module was taken up. So we're looking at that to see if there's any technical considerations. I think the bigger driver is not so much the hardware and the robustness of the hardware, but do we find a real need for station and a real compelling research environment, a real commercial aspect that station is viable for, and that will keep space station flying if we can see that other piece. But I think the physical hardware could be there until 2028, or maybe upgraded, or pieces could be done off of station. But I think our challenge is in the next couple of years is to kind of cement that future and figure out how we can really effectively utilize station for exploration and other activities. Some of the things Mark talked about, if we can put together some spacecraft from station, deploy them to go different places, that's a pretty exciting future. How can we use station in more of a test bed mode? We've got a hyperspectral imager on board station, which is really nice, that was put together by the Naval Research Lab in a very shortened period of time. It's not an operational instrument, but it's a great test bed to look at ways that they can be creative in putting together hardware. So we need to keep reaching out to these other folks that can utilize station and show that station is really viable, and then I think it could be there potentially for future use.
Yeah, and Gerst touched on something we really didn't mention in that Freedom to ISS transition. Freedom actually had a 30-year design life that we dropped down to save some money and try to do things a little different in that transition. But most of the designs were set on the U.S. side, so we really didn't change how we were building the components of the space station. We probably simplified the test programs because we didn't have to demonstrate as long a lifetime, and there were a couple sticky problems about maintenance that we didn't have to solve that we'll still face over time. But by and large, the systems were still designed for that much longer lifetime.
The benefit cost point that Bill brings up is really important, because that will ultimately determine it. And everybody should know that there is a real opportunity to reach a tipping point here in the next 5 years or so, where these laboratories become so productive that they'll draw users to them from the private sector, from the government sector, from all the way around. And that's going to change the whole prescription by the end of the decade. And provided that we get the transportation resources in place in the near future, there's every reason to believe that that's entirely possible.
Okay.
I just add one thing. When I sit here today and I kind of reflect back and I look at this picture behind us and all this is in orbit, it's some kind of miracle. I mean, we had so many opportunities along the way that this hardware wouldn't be in orbit. It's phenomenal. And so I think there's if the spirit is set right and we keep the longer term vision, and I think you clearly see it in the Russian culture, that they'll get diverted which way they can, but they keep focused on some long-term goal. And I think if we can keep that long-term goal, there's no limit to what we can accomplish. And we really are working better together multilaterally. There were times when I thought we might not ever work together multilaterally. I mean, we didn't want to exchange data. We didn't want to talk about things. We did U.S. air samples. The Russians did Russian air samples, and we would get two separate sets of data about what the same atmosphere really was, and they would not share data back and forth. And then when we had Columbia, we had no choice but to share samples and actually force researchers to look at other researchers, how they actually do analysis. So I think we need to just recognize that it's hard to predict the future, but if you keep focused and you keep moving and you keep the right vision, you can accomplish amazing things. And this is truly an amazing engineering feat that's here. And now our challenge is to take that same zeal and put it into the research arena and to see if we can reach that tipping point that Mark talks about, where this thing is really a benefit to us. It shows us that space has a real benefit to everyday people on the Earth. And the unique research environment of space station pays dividends to the elderly and pays dividends to our people here on the Earth, as well allows us to learn how to explore and go beyond low Earth orbit.
There's a reason that first lab was named Destiny.
Looking out at the room, most people in here work at NASA and have some sort of interest in the National Space Station. But outside of this building and outside of the agency, why does the space station matter what would you tell someone that didn't even know what the space station was, why it was important, and how it can affect their lives? Any of you?
I had a discussion years ago with a friend of mine from high school, and I was raised in a pretty small, fairly rural part of northwest Pennsylvania. And I was describing the space station from kind of all the challenge and hassles of the international partnership. And after listening to me rant for a while, I think she summed it up pretty well when she said, "Oh, so what you're really trying to say is it's just good for the globe." And from that partnership standpoint, you know, that's pretty much it. It's good for the globe.
Yeah, that's what I tell people. This is the largest international cooperative endeavor in science and technology in history. And we have the results to prove that it can be done, and we're halfway through the process, the assembly is over, and the best 10 years are in front of us.
And I think the scientific research aspect is also very intriguing to us, that, as Mark said at the very beginning, when you remove gravity from the equation, processes change. And as a researcher, you want to look at a process with differing variables or different constraints. So to remove gravity and then look at a process can yield tremendous new understandings that we haven't had before. So, you know, we know the immune system does different things in zero G, so we have a model. You know, the doctors have a model of how the immune system operates and works, but that's based on seeing it through a 1G influence. You remove zero gravity, then that model doesn't hold up and doesn't quite work right, so you're going to end up with a better model of the immune system, which can pay real benefits back to us here on Earth. So I think there's a chance here that we can gain some things and learn from space, that this new environment, this new test environment, just like any new place you go, you can learn more about things back on the Earth. I think, you know, one of the Apollo astronauts said we went all the way to the moon to learn more about the Earth. You know, and if you think about the lunar activities, probably some of the most compelling things is the pictures of the Earthrise from the moon. That's really changed our own perception of what the Earth is. You know, when you look at the images from space station, you know, I always look at that little thin blue line that sits there in the background, and that's our total atmosphere that protects us and that we live in. And if that can't change your perception of how we here on the Earth, you know, on this little blue marble floating in space, that's pretty dramatic. So I think, again, if we just keep our eyes open, keep our research moving, stay hungry, keep looking at different things, we can get tremendous benefit from space and space station. And we need to talk about it with folks, get them excited about what we're doing, and let them understand of how they can participate or how they can even contribute to some of the things we're doing. And we're looking for new ways of doing that with folks.
And I think there's a lot to be said for the human element, because we have many different space programs, and we see a lot from space with all kinds of robotic spacecraft going throughout the solar system. But there is something about sharing it with other people who've been there, who can describe it, who can feel it, who can tell us what it's really like, and that is very important for us to understand what that environment is.
You know, we've had a series of these roundtable discussions throughout the day. Marshall Space Flight Center had one, Kennedy Space Center, and also Johnson Space Center. Can you tell the audience and the people watching, what's your unique perspective from headquarters that maybe the other centers didn't have? I know some of you have worked in centers and also at headquarters. I know there's a political realm you have to deal with here in DC, which is a little different. How has that influenced and affected the National Space Station or your job?
The political element is huge, and it's not just political in terms of our nation's politics, right? But we've had that. As Gersh said, there was the one point right in the summer of '92 where the space station was almost canceled by one vote, and having gone through I kind of laugh today, right? People are talking about the NASA authorization bill as being very prescriptive about what kind of rocket or capsule we should build. Yet in those early space station days, we were told we were going to fly the lab before the HAB, 45 kilowatts of power, half the racks within the 10 to the minus 6 micro G range, right, Mark? You know?
Oh, yeah.
There were a whole dozen. In fact, we called them Dick Mallow's commandments that were captured in law that we had to deal with. And so the political environment for space station has always been very highly charged. And then that reflects in each of the partners. Not only has the partners been an important part of maintaining the base, political base for the space station, but they all have had their unique politics as well. And I know over the years, I think all of us have been to the different partners talking not just to our counterparts, but to their political sides as well, and trying to continue to keep that coalition strong.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how often we've had to work with our partners to help re-advocate the program, and we seem to each take our turn as to when that comes up in our budget or political cycle, after elections, whatever. And so to see how it works, what arguments are appropriate in all the different political systems is interesting. I guess the one that was the most eye-opening for me from the Washington policy view is when I had to go up on the Hill and explain why we wanted an exception in law to the Iran, North Korea, Syria Non-Proliferation Act, why we wanted to be able to have exchanges with Russia, why we were dependent on Soyuz. How did we get into that position? Why was it important? What was the value to NASA? And I had to go make that case to people in foreign policy committees who weren't space advocates, didn't really follow space, weren't looking at it from our program perspective, but were just looking at it from foreign policy non-proliferation perspective, and having to come up with a completely different set of arguments that would be compelling to them was quite an interesting job to have.
I would have traded you for my hearing.
I think what's kind of neat is when you see all the different perspectives is we all looked at the space station from our own individual perspectives where we were, and even at the centers, and they're all slightly different, but we're all really describing all the challenges each one of us individually faced. They were all different, but each one of us worked those challenges and pulled together, and I think you heard the same thing from the other centers today, that they also have a slightly different perspective of where they were when as they sat through this thing. So it's neat to get a chance to share and understand and see how people saw this thing come together. And it's interesting. It's very different depending on where folks were sitting at what time.
I think one more question I think I've got for you guys. It's 10 plus years in the future, and we're deorbiting the space station. What's the headline? What is the legacy of this orbiting laboratory? Is it just one soundbite that you think would kind of sum it all up, each of you? Mark?
This signals the ending of the dawn of the next industrial revolution in space. I really do believe that we're going to see an industrial revolution. This platform is a classic disruptive technology. It changes benchtop biology, chemistry, and physics if we have the wisdom to use it right. And although we've come close to letting it slip through our fingers many times over the past 20 years, I do think we're destined to succeed with it ultimately.
Great. You all agree with that assessment?
I think the headline is Space Station Extended.
I know, it's hard to think about it going away. All right, I think that's pretty much all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us this program. The 10th anniversary, once again, will officially be on November 2nd, 2010. We have a space shuttle launch coming up scheduled for November 1st. Join us for that on NASA television. Thank you for joining us.